Hey folks, I wanted to give you a run through of calculating hip rafters. Now here, the example on the screen, we have a roof. The first thing we'd have to do is actually figure out our common rafters because some of the details from the common rafters get carried over to the hip rafters, such as the height of the ridge and the height above plate and those things. Okay, so I already filled out the answer sheet for the common rafters, so when we need that information, I will show you where I got the answers for that, okay? But for now, we look at our hip rafters. Let's look at our worksheet and see what we need to do. So this example, it's a 10-12 roof. You can see here, 10-12. And the hip rafter is the same. So it's still a rise of 10, but instead of a run of 12, it is going to be a run of 16.97. So what I did is just quickly prepared our unit triangle here. So our unit run, 16.97, our unit rise, 10, and our unit line length is just the hypotenuse of those two numbers. Okay, and now that's different than the common rafter, which you can see is a 10-12 with the unit line length is 15.62. Okay, all right, so let's look. We need to determine the run of the hip. So the hip, as we can see in this picture here, the hip rafter runs from the corner to the ridge at a 45-degree angle, right? So what we do is we figure out, well, the run of the common rafter, this distance from the corner is the same as the run of the common. So all we have to do is take half the width of the building, which is the run of our common, and we need to square that. So the run of the common squared plus the run of the common squared. So let's have a look. Now our building is 23 foot 6. So if we take that number and we divide it by 2, we will have the run of the common slash the distance from the corner. Okay, so if we divide this by 2, we get 11.75 feet, which is 141 inches. Okay, so I like to convert that into inches so that all of our work gets done in inches. Okay, you could do it in feet; it would work just fine, but I just prefer that. Oops, that's the wrong sheet. Let me pull this one up. All right, so we have 141 inches squared plus 141 inches squared, and then we square root that for our a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and we get an answer of 199.40 inches. So the distance from the corner to the ridge horizontally, we haven't added our slope yet, but just horizontally is 199.4. So the way that this would look is we would take our unit line length, right? And so for this, it's 19.7. So unit line length is 19.70 over our unit run, which for a hip rafter is going to be 16.97. And the run of the hip, which is going to be 199.40 inches. Okay, so we cross multiply. We're going to multiply and then divide. And why don't I do it on the screen with you here so you can see. We've got 199.4 times 19.7 divided by 16.97. Okay, so we get a line length, so the length from working point 1, the ridge, to the wall for the hip rafter will be 231.48. So we can just call that 0.5 really, because we're going to round that up to a half of an inch will be the nearest number. Okay. Now we want to determine the projection of the hip. So similarly, we have to take the projection and we have to square it. So our projection for this roof, if I go back, is 16 inches. So what we want to do is we want to take 16 inches squared by 16 inches squared and figure out the hypotenuse of that. Okay, so very quickly we'll go 16 squared plus 16 squared and square root it. And so the run of the hip on the angle on the hypotenuse here is going to be 22.63. Okay, so 22.63, and that is our common rafter. Let me put that away for a second. Got too many windows open. All right. So the projection of the hip, that's the projection. The actual overhang would be the hypotenuse, the line length of that. So basically we've calculated so far in step 2, we calculated the distance from the ridge to the building line, and now the overhang will be from the building line to the tail out here. Okay, so we are going to use the same numbers. We have 19.7 and we have 16.97. The projection we said was going to be 22.63. That's what's in my calculator right now. And then we're going to cross multiply, divide. So let me go 22.63 times 19.7 divided by 16.97. And we get our overhang of 26.27 inches. So the total line length of the hip will be from the ridge to the fascia, and we just add together the answer here to the answer we had up here. And so we'll add together 231.5 really, plus this rounds to 1/4 of an inch, plus 26.25 inches. And then our answer will be nice and clean. It'll be measuring tape friendly. So 231.5 plus 26.25. 257.75 inches. So 257 3/4. That would be the overall length of the rafter. Let's just, out of curiosity, it's about 21.5 feet. Pretty big rafter. So that is, we have just calculated the run of that rafter, the hypotenuse. So we have our layout marks. Now, something that we have to go over, and you could check out the how to lay out a hip rafter video, is going over all of these layout lines and where these all come from. But ultimately we have our working point 1 to working point 2. That's what we got here. And then we have our working point 1 to working point 3, which is what we got in step 5 here when we added everything together. Okay, so that would get us to those positions. And if you watch the how to calculate or how to lay out hip rafter video, you'll see what we are doing at each the spots. So the shortening for the ridge, this drop for the hip, and the shortening for the fascia. Okay, last thing we need to do is figure out the length of the hip ridge. Okay, so we are shortening, but then we're also growing the hip ridge. So let's have a quick look at our hip ridge and why that is first shortened and then it grows. It's kind of a weird setup. So what we do is we take the length of the building and we subtract the width of the building. Okay, so that's the basic thing. So let me explain why we do that. Okay, so the length of the building is 38'9" and the width of the building is 23'6". Well, if we look, we have a common rafter here on the end of the roof, and we have a common rafter here on the other end of the roof. So the reason why we take the length minus the width is because we have our hip ridge, which runs from here to here. Our hip ridge, you can see, is 2 common rafter runs shorter than the building. So basically, the run of the common is the width of the building divided by 2, right? And so we go half the width of the building plus half the width of the building. So we end up adding on the total width of the building. So very simply, we're going to go 38'9" minus 23'6". So this is 38.75 minus 23.5 feet. And I have a calculator here somewhere. And we can quickly do that. So 38.75 minus 23.5. So it's saying that our distance from here to here is 15.25 feet. So 15'3" times 12. We'll have a nice clean number, 183 inches. Okay. Now that is our theoretical ridge length. So let's go back to the PowerPoint here. We have 183 inches. Let's go back to the PowerPoint for a second and have a look. So the theoretical length that we just calculated is measured from this dot to this dot right here and here. So we see that we actually have to add on 1/2 the thickness of the common rafter at each end, because everything's going to these theoretical points. They don't take into account the thickness of any of the wood. We are going to add on 3/4 of an inch and 3/4 of an inch. So we had 183 inches, and we're going to add on 3/4. We're going to add on 1.5 inches. So our actual ridge length will be 184.5 inches. Okay. So again, the tricky part with the hip rafter is not so much the calculating. It's very similar to the common rafter. We have to remember that the hip rafter meets the ridge at the same point. It just takes a longer distance to get there, right? And so the math is very similar. The really tricky part is the layout of the hip rafter and the cutting. And then for the ridge, we can figure out how much we're going to have to shorten that. Now, it's important to note on our worksheet that if we are doing a single cheek cut ridge, we are going to add 3/4 plus that 1/16. I'll explain that more in class. You can see it more in the PowerPoint. Anyways, I hope you guys find this helpful. Check out the other videos on calculating common rafters and calculating hip jack rafters as well. Okay, take care.